The rain turned the street into mirrors when she appeared, bare feet slapping wet asphalt. A little black girl in a torn pink dress ran straight toward the line of black sedans. The kind guarded by men who don't ask questions and don't hesitate. Her chest heaved with sobs that could tear the sky open. And when she screamed, the entire street held its breath. They hung my mom in the room. Please save her. If you're watching this right now, hit like, comment, share, and subscribe if you believe that even the most dangerous men can choose mercy when it matters most. Tell us where you're watching from. Now let's begin. The man who stepped from the center vehicle was Chairman Kang Juntae, a name whispered in boardrooms and back alleys with equal parts respect and fear. His suit was immaculate despite the rain, his expression carved from stone, and the dark tattoos visible at his collar spoke of a past no one questioned twice. He was the kind of man who controlled empires with a glance, who commanded loyalty through presence alone. This was not a man you ran toward. But Amani didn't know that. Or maybe she did, and desperation made her brave. When her legs buckled beneath her, Kang caught her. She crashed into his chest like a sparrow against glass, small fists clutching his jacket, as if he were the only solid thing left in the world. Behind him, his men moved into formation. Hands on earpieces, bodies forming a protective wall, but Kang raised one hand. Wait. He looked down at the child shaking in his arms. Her eyes were wide with terror, red marks circling her wrists, her breath coming in sharp, broken gasps. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't confusion. This was a child who had seen something no child should ever see. Where? Kang asked, his voice quiet but absolute. Amani's hand trembled as she pointed back toward a decaying apartment building squeezed between glass towers. A place the city had forgotten on purpose, where shadows grew thick and questions went unanswered. Please, she whispered, voice cracking. He said I should watch. Something flickered behind Kang's eyes. Something old and buried. He turned once. His men were already moving. The building smelled like mold and broken promises. The elevator hung dead in its shaft, so they took the stairs, boots echoing up 3 flights as Amani led them forward. When her legs gave out, Kang lifted her without hesitation, carrying her against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat. Steady, controlled, refusing to panic. The door to the apartment stood ajar like an open wound. Inside, the room was bare. A single overturned chair. Cracked walls. And there, suspended from a beam meant for drying clothes, hung Nia Okafor, Amani's mother. Not dead. Not yet. Her wrists were bound, her body limp, her breathing shallow and uneven. The room fell into a terrible silence as Kang's men surged forward. One sliced through the rope. Another checked for a pulse. Kang himself caught her weight, lowering her to the floor with a care that seemed impossible for hands that had broken so many things. Amani collapsed beside her mother, sobbing into her shoulder with the kind of relief that breaks you open from the inside. Mommy, I'm here. I brought help. I told them. Kang knelt in the ruin of his expensive suit, pressing 2 fingers to Nia's neck. A pulse. Faint but fighting. She lives, he said quietly. The relief in the room was almost violent. But relief didn't erase the rage building behind Kang's eyes. Cold, controlled, and absolute. Between gasping breaths, Nia explained in fragments. A man asking questions about the building's former owner, about hidden documents, about things she knew nothing about. When she couldn't give him answers, he returned with rope. He tied Amani's hands. He made her watch. Then he left, promising to come back. Kang listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. But inside, old ghosts stirred. Memories of a sister lost in a fire meant for someone else. Promises made too late. Debts that could never be repaid. He stood. Get a doctor, he ordered. Quietly. One of his lieutenants hesitated. And the man? Kang looked down at Amani, who clung to his leg now with a trust that felt impossibly heavy. Her eyes were wide, terrified still, but also hopeful in a way that cut deeper than any blade. He will not come back, Kang said simply. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact already written. They moved Nia to a private clinic before dawn broke over the city. Kang stayed until the doctor confirmed she would survive. Only then did he allow himself to exhale. Amani refused to let go of his hand the entire time. Her small fingers wrapped around his like a lifeline. You're scary, she told him softly from the waiting room chair, studying his face with the brutal honesty only children possess. But you're nice. The faintest ghost of a smile touched Kang's mouth, an expression his own men would have paid to witness. I am many things, he said quietly. Nice is new. What Kang didn't tell her was that nice wasn't something he'd been in a very long time. The city knew him as a king without mercy, a man who built an empire on fear and absolute control. But before the empire, before the tattoos and the reputation that made grown men lower their eyes, before all of that, there was a boy who couldn't save his sister. And now, looking at Amani's hopeful eyes, Kang realized something that would change everything. Some debts can't be settled with money or power. Some debts require you to become someone different entirely. Hello, my friends. Thanks for joining me on this fascinating story. Before we continue, please kindly help subscribe to the channel, like the video and comment where you are watching from, and what time it's at your yendi. Now let's continue with our story. But that realization came later. In this moment, in the rain-soaked street with a trembling child pointing toward a forgotten building, Kang Juntae was exactly who the city believed him to be. Chairman, boss, king. The men surrounding him moved like a single organism. 20 years of loyalty built on results, not affection. They didn't follow Kang because he was kind. They followed because he made impossible things happen, because crossing him meant disappearing so completely even your enemies forgot your name. His empire stretched from shipping ports to construction contracts, from legitimate business towers to the kind of establishments that only existed in whispered conversations. He had built it all from nothing. From blood and broken knuckles and a ruthlessness that made older, crueler men step aside. Mercy wasn't part of the blueprint. Yet here he stood, rain soaking through a suit worth more than most people's monthly salary, holding a frightened child who had no idea who she'd collided with. His lieutenant, Park Min-soo, stood 3 feet away with a hand hovering near his jacket, not threatening, just ready. Always ready. The others formed a loose perimeter, scanning rooftops and alleyways with the paranoia that kept dangerous men alive. Boss, Park said quietly, his tone careful. Should we call? No. Kang's voice cut clean. No police. No questions that would lead to reports, to investigations, to complications that would slow everything down. He could see it already. The bureaucracy, the paperwork, the hours wasted while someone's mother hung dying in a forgotten room. He'd seen enough death to know how quickly it arrived when you hesitated. Kang looked down at Amani. She was staring up at him with eyes that should have held fear, and did, but also something else. Something that looked dangerously like hope. It was the most foolish thing he'd seen all week. You trust me? He asked her, his voice low and steady. She nodded, small and jerking, like she wasn't entirely sure but had run out of options. Good. Kang straightened, still holding her. His mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating distances, response times, variables. We move now. Park, take point. Junho, bring the second vehicle around. Radio silence unless necessary. The men responded instantly, no questions, no hesitation. This was what separated his organization from common thugs, discipline that bordered on military precision. They understood that when Kang gave an order, the world rearranged itself to make it happen. He carried Amani to the lead sedan, setting her carefully in the back seat. She looked impossibly small against the black leather, her torn pink dress a splash of color in his monochrome world. When he slid in beside her, she immediately pressed against his side, seeking warmth or safety or both. Kang didn't tell her to stop. The convoy moved through the rain-slicked streets with coordinated silence, 3 vehicles forming a protective cocoon. No sirens. No urgency that would draw attention. Just power moving with absolute certainty toward a destination that didn't know it was about to be invaded. Inside the sedan, Amani's trembling had slowed but not stopped. Kang could feel her heartbeat through her small frame, still too fast, still afraid. He wondered distantly when he'd last held something this fragile. Years. Decades, maybe. His world didn't allow for fragility. The man, Kang said quietly, not looking at her. Did you see his face? Amani nodded against his side. Would you know him again? Another nod. Then so softly he almost missed it. He smiled. When he tied the rope. He smiled. Something cold and ancient stirred in Kang's chest. Not anger, because anger was hot and reckless. This was different. This was the kind of calculation that ended bloodlines. The building came into view exactly as Amani had described it. A decaying apartment block squeezed between glass towers like a rotting tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. The city had plans to demolish it, Kang knew. Progress always ate the old neighborhoods eventually. But until then, it stood as a reminder that not everyone lived in the light. The vehicles pulled to the curb in formation. Park exited first, scanning. Junho followed, hand inside his jacket. The rain fell harder now, turning the street into a river of reflected neon. Kang lifted Amani again. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. "Third floor," she whispered. "The door with the broken lock." He nodded once. The men formed up around him. A wall of suits and silent violence moving toward the building's entrance. And then, as if on cue, every light in the building flickered once, twice, and died completely. The darkness swallowed the building whole, turning its windows into empty eyes staring back at them. Somewhere in that blackness, a door slammed shut. The sound echoed down the street like a gunshot. Park's hand went to his weapon. Junho's radio crackled once, then went silent. Kang felt Amani's grip tighten around his neck, her breath quickening against his collar. "He's still here," she breathed. "He came back." Kang's expression didn't change. He simply adjusted his hold on the child and began walking toward the darkened entrance, his men falling into formation around him like shadows learning to hunt. The lobby smelled like forgotten things, mold and rust and decades of neglect pressed into cracked tile and peeling paint. Emergency lighting should have kicked in when the power died, but the fixtures hung empty, their bulbs stolen or shattered long ago. The only illumination came from the street behind them, weak and fading with each step deeper into the building. Park produced a flashlight, the beam cutting through darkness thick enough to choke on. It revealed graffiti-covered walls, a row of rusted mailboxes hanging open like broken jaws, and the elevator, doors frozen half open. Its interior a black throat that reeked of urine and standing water. "Stairs," Kang said quietly. They found the stairwell behind a door that groaned on corroded hinges. The concrete steps were cracked and uneven, each one slick with something that glistened in the flashlight beam. Water. Or something worse. The walls closed in tight, forcing them to move single file. Park leading, Kang in the middle with Amani, Junho and 3 others following like a chain of silent violence ascending into darkness. The smell grew worse with each floor. Decay and desperation and cheap cooking oil that had turned rancid. Somewhere above them, something skittered across the floor. Rats probably. Though in a place like this Kang wouldn't bet on it. Amani's breathing had turned sharp and shallow against his neck. Her whole body trembled now, not from cold but from memory. From knowing what waited at the top of these stairs. "Which floor?" Kang asked softly. 3, she whispered. Then even quieter. "He locked me in the closet. But I heard everything. Her screaming. The chair falling. Then nothing. Just him laughing." Park glanced back, his expression unreadable in the shadows. Kang met his eyes for a fraction of a second. No words were needed. They'd both seen enough darkness to know what awaited them. The question was only how much darkness, and whether they'd arrived in time to do anything about it. The 3rd floor landing was worse than the others. The walls here were scorched black in places, evidence of a fire someone had tried and failed to contain. The hallway stretched ahead of them like a throat, doors hanging crooked on both sides, some missing entirely. At the far end, barely visible in the dim light filtering from a broken window, one door stood slightly ajar. Amani's grip on Kang tightened until her small fingers dug into his shoulders. "There," she breathed. Kang felt her legs give out completely, her body going limp with exhausted terror. He adjusted his hold, cradling her more carefully now, and continued forward. His men spread out instinctively, 2 covering the hallway behind them, 2 moving ahead to clear the corners. This was the dangerous moment. The moment when you were committed, exposed, when any threat could emerge from the shadows with the advantage of terrain and preparation. But Kang had stopped calculating danger years ago. Danger was just another factor, like weather or traffic. Something to acknowledge and move through. The apartment door creaked as Park pushed it wider. The hinges shrieked in protest, the sound obscene in the heavy silence. And then they were inside. The room was small, bare walls stained with water damage and time. A single window covered by newspaper gone yellow with age. An overturned chair in the center of the floor, one leg broken. And above it, suspended from a beam meant for drying clothes, Nia Okafor hung like a discarded puppet, her body swaying almost imperceptibly in the air disturbed by their entrance. The sight hit the room like a physical blow. Her wrists were bound with the same rope that circled her neck, arms pulled upward at an unnatural angle, her head tilted forward, chin against chest, long braids obscuring her face. Her feet dangled inches above the floor, close enough to suggest hope, far enough to steal it. She wore a cleaning uniform, the kind worn by people who worked invisible jobs in the city's gleaming towers. The fabric was torn at the shoulder. She wasn't moving. For one terrible heartbeat, Kong thought they were too late. Then he saw her chest rise, barely, a flutter so faint it could have been imagination, but real. Now, he said. His men moved like they'd rehearsed it. Park surged forward, pulling a knife from his belt in one smooth motion. Junho positioned himself beneath Nia, arms raised to catch her weight. Another man steadied the beam. And Kong, still holding Amani, moved to where he could see the rope clearly, tracking the knot with eyes that had learned to find weaknesses in everything. The blade cut clean. The rope parted with a sound like a sigh. Nia collapsed into Junho's arms, but Kong was already there, taking her weight himself because some instinct older than thought told him this mattered. That letting someone else catch her would be wrong. He lowered her to the floor with a care that would have shocked anyone who knew his reputation, cradling her head, checking the rope marks on her neck with fingers that could break bones but now touched with surgical precision. Amani threw herself from his arms, dropping to her knees beside her mother with a sob that could shatter steel. "Mommy, I brought help," she cried, tiny hands grabbing at Nia's face, her shoulders, anywhere she could reach. "I told them. I ran so fast. Please wake up. Please." Kong pressed 2 fingers to Nia's neck, searching for the pulse point beneath swollen, bruised skin. The silence stretched impossibly long. Park stood frozen, knife still in hand. Junho didn't breathe. Then Kong felt it, faint and fluttering like a bird with broken wings, but fighting. Still fighting. His eyes met Park's in the darkness. "She lives." The words broke the spell. Movement erupted in the small room. Controlled chaos orchestrated by men who understood that seconds mattered now. Park was already on his radio, voice low and clipped. "Medical. 3rd floor east side. Strangulation, unconscious, breathing compromised. 5 minutes." Not a request. An order to reality itself. Junho stripped off his jacket, folding it into a makeshift pillow that he slid beneath Nia's head. Another man, Sungmin, the one who'd been a medic before choosing a different kind of service, dropped to his knees beside Kong, fingers moving to check Nia's airways, her breathing pattern, the discoloration spreading across her throat like a bruise-colored necklace. "Pulse is weak but steady," Sungmin reported, his voice clinical despite the horror of the scene. "Airways partially restricted. She needs oxygen, for fluids, and a hospital. But she'll make it to the ambulance." Kong nodded once, still holding Nia's weight even though Junho could have taken over. His suit was ruined now, blood and dirt, and the stain of someone else's suffering pressed into expensive fabric. He didn't care. Couldn't care, because Amani was still crying into her mother's shoulder. And that sound was doing something dangerous to the walls he'd built inside himself. "Mommy, please wake up." Amani sobbed. "Please. I was so scared. I ran so far." Nia's eyelids fluttered. Her lips moved, forming words without sound. Then, with visible effort that must have cost her everything, she opened her eyes, bloodshot, unfocused, but aware. "Amani," she breathed, the name barely a whisper. The girl's sobs turned into something between laughter and hysteria. She pressed her face against her mother's cheek, her whole body shaking with relief too big to contain. Kong eased back slightly, giving them space. His men had already formed a perimeter. 2 at the door, 1 at the window, others scanning the apartment with the kind of paranoid attention that kept people alive in hostile territory. They moved like they were securing a crime scene, which Kong supposed they were. He studied Nia's face as she struggled to focus. She couldn't be older than 30. though the lines around her eyes suggested someone who'd worked too many night shifts and shouldered too many burdens. Her cleaning uniform bore a logo he recognized, one of the commercial buildings in Gangnam. Honest work. Invisible work. The kind that paid enough to survive, but never enough to escape. What happened? He asked quietly, his voice cutting through Amani's sobs without drowning them out. Nia's eyes found his. Fear flickered there first. The natural response to a man who looked like Kong, who arrived with armed men and gave orders that reality obeyed. But beneath the fear was something harder. Anger maybe. Or desperation. A man, she rasped, each word dragging across her damaged throat like broken glass. 3 days ago. Asked about the building's owner. About hidden rooms. Documents. Park's head turned slightly. Not enough to break his watch, but enough to signal he was listening. I clean offices, Nia continued, wincing with each syllable. I don't know anything about whatever he wanted. I told him that. He didn't believe me. Her hand moved weakly toward Amani, fingers trembling. The girl grabbed it, holding tight. He came back yesterday. Brought the rope. Tied Amani first. Made me watch. Her voice cracked. Said if I didn't remember by morning, he'd make sure I never forgot. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Kang's expression hadn't changed, but something in his stillness had shifted, become sharper, more focused, like a blade finding the exact angle to cut deepest. Did you see his face? Yes. Nia's eyes closed briefly, the memory clearly painful. 40s. Scar here. She touched her own cheek, indicating a line from temple to jaw. Spoke Korean but wrong accent. Northern maybe. Or Chinese. Kang's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His mind was already working, cataloging details, cross-referencing patterns, identifying which of his many enemies or rivals might have sent someone to this forgotten building. To terrorize a cleaning woman over documents that might not even exist. But beneath the calculation, something older stirred. A memory of different screams, different flames, a different girl who'd needed saving and hadn't gotten it. His sister's face, young, terrified, calling his name while fire devoured the only home they'd known. He'd been 12. Too young, too weak, too slow. By the time he'd broken through the door, she was already gone. Amani was still holding her mother's hand, still crying, but alive. Both of them alive. The parallel was too perfect. The universe offering a second chance it had no right to offer. Kong stood slowly, his movements controlled, but somehow predatory. Park recognized the shift immediately. The subtle change in his boss's posture that meant calculations had been made and decisions reached. Medical is en route, Park said quietly. 3 minutes out. Kong nodded. Then, in the same controlled voice he used to order executions. After they're stable, relocate them. Somewhere clean. Somewhere watched. 24-hour security. Yes, sir. And find out who owns this building. Who owned it before? Every transaction, every contract, every name connected to this address for the last 20 years. Park's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened with understanding. This wasn't just about helping someone anymore. This was about answers. And people who hurt Kang's answers rarely walked away intact. The lieutenant hesitated for one careful moment, then asked the question hanging in the air like smoke. What about the man? Kong looked down at Amani, still clutching her mother, still trusting that the scary man in the ruined suit would make everything safe. His voice, when it came, was quieter than a whisper but harder than diamonds. Find him. The private clinic occupied the top 3 floors of a building Kang's organization owned in Gangnam. Legitimate on paper, but equipped to handle questions that hospitals would report and injuries that required discretion. Dr. Yoon met them at the service entrance, her expression carefully neutral as she took in the scene. A powerful crime boss carrying an unconscious woman while a small child clung to his leg. She'd worked for Kong long enough to know better than to ask questions. Examination room 3, she said simply. It's ready. They moved Nia onto a bed that was cleaner and softer than anything she'd likely slept on in years. Monitors were attached, IVs inserted, oxygen flowing through a mask that fogged with each precious breath. Dr. Yoon worked with efficient silence, her hands gentle despite the clinical nature of her assessment. Kong stood against the wall, still wearing his ruined suit, watching everything. Amani had attached herself to him again. Literally, her arms wrapped around his leg, face pressed against his knee. She hadn't let go since they'd carried her mother out of that apartment. As if releasing him might make everything disappear like a dream she couldn't afford to wake from. Severe trauma to the larynx and trachea, Dr. Yoon reported quietly, glancing at Kong over her surgical mask. Significant bruising, some internal swelling. She's lucky, another few minutes and the damage would have been irreversible. As it is, she'll recover fully. 2 weeks of rest, antibiotics for potential infection, therapy for the throat muscles. How long until she wakes? Few hours, maybe less. I've given her something for the pain. When she does wake, she'll be frightened and disoriented. It would help if someone familiar was here. Kong looked down at Amani. The girl was swaying on her feet, exhaustion finally catching up with adrenaline. Her eyes were half closed, but her grip on his leg hadn't loosened even slightly. "I'll stay," he said. Park, who'd been standing by the door coordinating security, through quiet radio chatter, paused mid-sentence. It was the briefest hesitation, barely noticeable, but Kong caught it. His lieutenant had worked for him for 15 years, and had never once seen him stay anywhere for anyone who wasn't actively making him money or solving a problem. This was neither. This was something else entirely. The hours crawled past like wounded animals. Kong sat in the chair beside Nia's bed. Amani curled in his lap because the girl had simply refused any other arrangement. She'd tried lying on the spare bed Dr. Yoon had brought in, but within minutes she was up again, stumbling toward Kong with tears streaming down her face, terrified that if she closed her eyes he'd vanish and the nightmare would start over. So he held her, let her small body press against his chest, feeling her heartbeat gradually slow from panic to something approaching peace. Her breathing evened out, but even in sleep her fingers stayed twisted in his shirt, holding on like he was the only anchor in a storm-tossed world. Outside the windows, Seoul's lights painted the night in neon and ambition. Somewhere in those streets, Park's men were hunting. They'd already identified 3 possible suspects from the building's security footage. Grainy, incomplete, but enough. One had a scar matching Nia's description. That man was being followed now, his movements tracked and catalogued, his patterns studied. Kong would have the full report by morning. And by morning after that, the man would understand what it meant to make Chairman Kong Juntae's list. But that was future violence. Present moment, there was only this. A child sleeping in his arms, trusting him with the kind of absolute faith that was either beautiful or terrifying depending on how you looked at it. Around 3 a.m., Amani stirred. Her eyes opened, heavy, confused, focusing slowly on Kang's face in the dim light. "You stayed," she whispered, surprise evident even through her exhaustion. "I said I would." She studied him for a long moment, her expression far too serious for someone so young. Then, with the brutal honesty only children possess, "You're scary. Everyone looks scared of you. Even your friends." Kang's mouth almost twitched. Almost. "They're not friends. They're employees." "But you're nice," Amani continued, as if he hadn't spoken. "You caught my mommy. You carried me. Scary people aren't supposed to be nice." He didn't know how to respond to that. In his world, nice was synonymous with weak, and weak was synonymous with dead. He'd built his empire by being the opposite of nice, by making fear into a weapon more reliable than any gun. "I am many things," he said finally, the same words he'd used earlier. "Nice is new." Amani's eyes were already closing again, sleep pulling her back under. But her grip on his shirt tightened once more, and just before she drifted off she mumbled, "I like new." Morning came with Dr. Yoon's return and good news. Nia was stable, improving, out of danger. Kong made calls. By noon, arrangements were complete. A secure apartment overlooking the Han River, furniture delivered and assembled, a pantry stocked with food that neither Nia nor Amani had to worry about affording, security cameras installed at every entrance, motion sensors, panic buttons in every room. 2 of his men would patrol the building. 2 more would maintain a perimeter. Nothing would touch them. Nothing would even get close enough to try. Park appeared in the doorway of the clinic room as afternoon light slanted through the windows. His expression was carefully blank, which meant the news was significant. "Boss," he said quietly. "We found him." Kong looked down at Amani, who'd finally moved to the spare bed, and was sleeping deeply, one hand still stretched toward him as if to make sure he hadn't disappeared. He stood slowly, careful not to wake her. Where? The warehouse was in Incheon, tucked between shipping containers, and the kind of industrial silence that swallowed screams. Kong didn't go there. He didn't need to. Some debts settled themselves once the machinery was set in motion, and his machinery was precise. Park called at 11 p.m., his voice flat and professional. "It's done." Confirmation. The scar matches. He identified himself before it was finished. Said he was hired to extract information about property deeds from the 1990s. Old development deals. Someone's trying to prove ownership claims that were never properly documented. Kong stood at the window of his penthouse office, soul spreading below him like a circuit board of light and ambition. The information meant something. A thread in a larger tapestry of corruption and contested territory. But that was business. Business could wait. The body won't be found. Not by anyone who matters. And the client who hired him? A pause. "Then we're working on it. He gave us a name before the end. We'll have confirmation by morning." Good. Kang's reflection in the glass showed nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, nothing at all. "Close it quietly." He ended the call and returned to the hospital wing of his building, where Amani still slept in the spare bed, her breathing deep and even. For the first time since he'd met her, she wasn't clutching anything. Her hands lay open and relaxed on the blanket, her face peaceful in a way that suggested her nightmares had finally released their grip. Across the room, Nia had woken an hour earlier. Dr. Yoon had removed the breathing tube, and though her voice was still rough and painful, she could speak. She'd cried when she first saw Amani sleeping safely beside her, great shaking sobs that her damaged throat couldn't quite contain. Then she'd looked at Kong with an expression he couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she'd whispered. He'd nodded once. What else was there to say? Now he sat in the chair he'd occupied for most of the past 36 hours, watching Amani sleep, and thinking about the mathematics of violence. In his world, mercy wasn't weakness. It was mathematics. You showed mercy when it benefited you, when it built loyalty or prevented larger conflicts. You withheld it when an example needed to be made, when fear served better than forgiveness. The man who'd hung Nia Okafor from that beam had earned no mercy. Not through his actions, but through his choice of victims. He'd selected someone powerless, someone invisible, someone who couldn't fight back or call for help. That kind of cruelty wasn't strategic. It was recreational. And men who hurt people for recreation didn't stop until someone made them. Kong hadn't watched. He never did when the debt was personal. There was a difference between necessary violence and violence you savored, and he'd learned long ago to keep that line visible. He didn't enjoy what his men had done in that Incheon warehouse. He simply accepted it as the inevitable consequence of a choice someone else had made. Some debts didn't require witnesses. They just required completion. The days blurred into a routine that felt foreign to Kang's usual existence. He checked in daily, sometimes twice, at the clinic where Nia recovered. He brought things Amani needed. New clothes that fit properly, books in English and Korean, colored pencils that she used to draw increasingly elaborate pictures. She drew the rain that first night. The black cars. A tall figure in a dark suit standing very still while chaos swirled around him. She drew her mother lying in a clean bed instead of hanging from a rope. She drew herself smiling. The drawings accumulated on the wall beside her bed. A gallery of trauma processing through a child's hands. Nia improved rapidly once the immediate danger passed. Dr. Yoon was cautiously optimistic. Barring complications, she'd make a full recovery. The psychological scars would take longer, but the physical ones would heal clean. Kong had his people handle everything else. The apartment overlooking the Han River was ready, fully furnished, security installed and tested. He'd arranged for Nia to transfer to a new cleaning service, one that paid better and didn't assign shifts in buildings with forgotten histories. Amani would start at a good school, one where her accent wouldn't matter, and her past would stay buried under paperwork his lawyers had expertly sanitized. He told himself it was loose ends. Liability management. ensuring that the people who'd seen too much of his operation were comfortable enough not to talk and loyal enough not to run. It was a lie, but lies were sometimes necessary for men like him to justify doing decent things. 3 weeks after that rainy night, Kong stood in the doorway of the clinic room preparing to leave for Busan. Business that had been delayed too long already. His absence had been noticed. Questions were being asked. He needed to remind certain people why asking questions about his schedule was dangerous. Amani was coloring at the small table Dr. Yoon had brought in, her legs swinging beneath the chair, humming something off-key but happy. Nia sat propped up in bed reading, her throat still healing but her voice returning slowly. Kong cleared his throat. Amani's head snapped up. Her eyes widened, and for a terrible moment he saw fear there. The fear of abandonment, of promises broken, of safety being temporary. Then she was running toward him, barefoot again though this time by choice, arms outstretched. "Are you leaving?" The question trembled with something that made his chest tight. He crouched in front of her, meeting her eyes at her level. "I have to go to Busan. Business. Forever." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with all the times adults had left her before, all the times safety had proven temporary. Kong felt something shift inside him, some final wall crumbling that he hadn't even known was still standing. "No," he said quietly. "Not forever." The lie became truth through repetition. Kong told himself he visited the apartment overlooking the Han River because it was good business. Keeping assets secure, ensuring investments stayed stable, maintaining control over loose ends. He told Park the same thing when his lieutenant's carefully neutral expression suggested questions he was too smart to ask aloud. But business meetings didn't usually involve sitting on the floor helping a 7-year-old practice Korean alphabet. Business didn't usually smell like the food Nia cooked. Recipes from home mixed with ingredients she was learning to find in Seoul's markets, creating something that belonged to neither place and both. Amani had started school 3 weeks after moving in. A good school, private but not ostentatious, where the teachers asked few questions about the men in dark suits who dropped her off and picked her up. She'd been terrified that first morning, her small hand crushing Kang's fingers as they walked through the gates. "What if they don't like me?" she'd whispered. "What if I say words wrong?" Kong had crouched down, adjusting her backpack with hands more accustomed to violence than tenderness. "Then they're stupid. And you don't need stupid people to like you." She'd laughed despite her fear, and that sound had stayed with him all day. Through meetings about territorial disputes and negotiations over shipping contracts. Through all of it, some part of his mind had been counting hours until he could check that she'd survived her first day intact. She had. More than survived, she'd thrived. Within a month she was bringing home Korean words like treasures, testing them on Kong during his visits. "Appa," she'd said one evening, the word careful on her tongue. "That means dad, right?" The room had gone very quiet. Nia's hands had frozen over the vegetables she was cutting. Kong had felt something in his chest twist uncomfortably. "Yes," he'd said evenly. "It means that." Amani had nodded, filing the information away, and moved on to the next word. But Kong had seen Nia's expression, complicated, grateful, and terrified in equal measure. The drawings multiplied. Amani drew everything. Her classroom, her new friends, the river view from their windows. But mostly she drew him. Kong standing beside his car. Kong sitting in their living room. Kong in the rain that first night, perfectly still while the world moved around him. That last one she presented to him with particular pride, colored pencils creating a scene he barely remembered, but she clearly couldn't forget. In her version he was impossibly tall, his dark suit drawn in careful black strokes. Around him, rain, lights, chaos. But in the center him standing very still, looking down at a small figure in pink. "That's when I knew," she'd explained, pointing at the drawing. "You didn't run away. Everyone always runs away or tells me to go away. But you just stayed." Kong had taken the drawing home. It sat on his desk now, incongruous among financial reports and security briefings. Park had noticed it immediately but said nothing, which was somehow worse than questions. The visits became routine. Tuesday and Thursday evenings, Sunday afternoons. Kong told himself it was scheduled surveillance, maintaining visibility, ensuring the investment of protection was being properly utilized. But he knew, even if he wouldn't admit it, that he simply wanted to be there. Nia had recovered fully. Her voice returned to normal. The bruises faded to memory. She'd gone back to work, though at the better-paying service Kong had arranged. She was careful around him. Always grateful, always respectful, but with an underlying tension that suggested she understood how precarious their situation was. One evening, after Amani had gone to bed, Nia had tried to talk about it. "Mr. Kong," she'd started, hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. "I don't know how to. We owe you everything. Our lives. This apartment. Amani's school. But I don't want her to." She'd stopped, struggling with words that were dangerous no matter how she arranged them. "To get attached." Kong had finished for her. "Yes." Relief and shame had crossed her face simultaneously. "You've been so kind. But your world isn't safe," Kong had supplied. "Permanent. Appropriate for a child to depend on." Nia had nodded miserably, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Kong had looked toward Amani's room, where the girl slept surrounded by drawings and stuffed animals, and all the security his money could buy, but not the one thing she actually needed. Stability that didn't depend on the whims of a crime lord who'd taken pity on her. "I know," he'd said quietly. And he did know. He knew exactly how dangerous it was for her to trust him, to look at him with those eyes that expected him to fix things and make the world safe. He knew because he'd started expecting it of himself too. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. But knowing didn't change anything. The weeks accumulated into months. Amani's Korean improved. Her nightmares decreased. The drawings evolved. More colors, more smiles, more scenes of everyday happiness that suggested healing was happening despite everything. Kong found himself staying longer during visits, helping with homework, listening to stories about school that shouldn't have interested him, but somehow did. Sitting in comfortable silence while Nia cooked and Amani drew and the apartment filled with something that felt dangerously close to peace. He told himself it was temporary. A phase that would end once his conscience was satisfied, once the debt he owed to his dead sister's memory was paid. He told himself he was still the same man who'd built an empire on fear and calculation. It was a lie, but lies were sometimes necessary for men like him to justify feeling human. Then business called. Real business, the kind that couldn't be delegated or delayed. Territorial disputes in Busan that required his presence, his authority, his willingness to remind people why crossing him was fatal. He waited until Sunday dinner to tell them. Amani was chattering about a field trip, her face animated and happy. Nia was smiling as she served food, the shadows that had haunted her eyes finally fading. Kong set down his chopsticks. "I need to go to Busan," he said. "Tomorrow. Business that's been delayed too long." The words landed like stones in water, ripples spreading across the comfortable atmosphere. Amani's smile faltered. "How long?" "A week. Maybe 2. And then you'll come back?" Her voice was small, carefully controlled in that way children use when they're trying not to cry. Kong left early Monday morning, before the city fully woke. He told himself it was easier this way. No prolonged goodbyes, no questions he didn't know how to answer, no small face pressed against the window watching him leave. Clean breaks were always better. But when he reached the elevator at the end of the hallway, he heard it. The sound of bare feet slapping against polished floor, running fast and desperate. "Wait." He turned. Amani burst through the apartment door, still in her pajamas, the ones with cartoon bears that she'd picked out herself, her hair wild from sleep, eyes wide with panic. Behind her, Nia appeared in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth, frozen between stopping her daughter and letting this moment happen. The girl ran the length of the hallway without slowing, her breath coming in hitches that suggested she'd been crying or was about to start. She crashed into Kong before he could move, small arms wrapping around his legs with desperate strength. "Are you going forever?" The words tumbled out broken and rushed. "Because people always say they're coming back, but then they don't. My dad said he was coming back. My grandma said she'd visit. Everyone says not forever, but they mean forever, and I know you're important and busy and you probably have better things to do than visit us, but please." "Amani." Kang's voice cut through her spiral gently but firmly. She stopped, looking up at him with eyes that were too old for 7. Eyes that had learned not to trust promises, because promises were things adults broke without thinking twice. Kang glanced down the hallway. Park waited by the elevator, pretending to check his phone. 2 other men stood by the stairwell, studying the walls with sudden intense interest. Everyone giving him space for this moment while simultaneously bearing witness to something they'd probably discuss in careful whispers later. Kang didn't care. He set down his briefcase and crouched, not bending slightly, not half kneeling, but dropping fully to Amani's level, so their eyes met directly. His expensive suit touched the floor. His carefully maintained image of untouchable authority collapsed into something more honest, and infinitely more dangerous. "Listen to me," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same absolute certainty he used when giving orders that moved millions of dollars and ended lives. "I am going to Busan. I will be gone approximately 10 days. Then I am coming back here. But what if I don't leave people I protect?" The words were simple, flat, carrying no emotion but somehow weighted with something heavier than any promise. "And I protect you. Both of you. That doesn't end because I go to Busan. That doesn't end because work gets complicated. That doesn't end." Amani studied his face with the intensity only children possess, looking for the lie, the catch, the moment where adults revealed they'd been pretending all along. Kang let her look. He had nothing to hide, not from her, not about this. "You promise?" she whispered. Kang thought about all the promises he'd made in his life, to allies who'd betrayed him, to enemies before killing them, to himself in the mirror of his penthouse while building an empire on other people's fear. He thought about his sister, burning in flames he couldn't reach. He thought about all the ways promises could break and people could disappear. "I promise," he said. The words felt strange in his mouth. Foreign. Like speaking a language he'd forgotten he knew. Amani stared at him for one more heartbeat. Then something in her small body released. All the tension, all the fear, all the accumulated trauma of a childhood where adults disappeared and safety was always temporary. She threw herself forward, arms wrapping around his neck with force that nearly knocked him backward. Kang caught her automatically, his arms coming up to hold her steady. She pressed her face into his shoulder and finally started crying. Not the panicked sobs from before, but something deeper, quieter, like a pressure valve finally releasing. "Okay," she whispered against his collar. "Okay. I believe you." Kang felt something crack in his chest, some final wall he'd built 30 years ago when his sister died, and he'd learned that caring about people was just another way the world could destroy you. The wall crumbled now, and behind it was something he'd forgotten existed. The simple, terrible vulnerability of mattering to someone. He held Amani while she cried, one hand on her back, steady and still. Down the hallway, Nia leaned against the doorframe with tears streaming silently down her face. Park had turned completely away now, giving them privacy while simultaneously ensuring no threat could approach. Finally, Amani pulled back slightly, wiping her nose on her pajama sleeve. 10 days. Maybe 9, Kang said. "I'll work quickly." She nodded seriously, as if they were negotiating a business contract. "And you'll call?" "Every evening." "Promise." "I already promised. I don't do it twice." A small smile broke through her tears, fragile but real. "Okay." She looked at him for another moment, then seemed to remember something. "Oh, wait." She pulled free and ran back toward the apartment, disappearing inside. Kang straightened slowly, his knees protesting the extended crouch. He was getting too old for sitting on floors and kneeling in hallways. Or maybe he'd just forgotten how until recently. Amani returned clutching one of her drawings, the one of him standing in the rain, perfectly still while chaos swirled around him. "Take this," she said, pressing it into his hands. "So you remember to come back." Kang looked down at the drawing, at the careful black strokes representing his suit, at the small pink figure reaching toward him, at the rain falling everywhere except where they stood together. "I won't forget," he said quietly. "I know. But take it anyway." He took it. Amani hugged him once more, quick and fierce, then ran back to her mother. Nia scooped her up, mouthing "thank you" over her daughter's head with an expression Kang couldn't quite read. Gratitude. Relief. Something else that looked like understanding. Kong nodded once, picked up his briefcase, and turned toward the elevator where Park waited. "Ready, boss?" his lieutenant asked neutrally. Kong looked down at the drawing in his hand, already slightly crumpled, colored pencil smudging at the edges. "Yes," he said. But as the elevator doors closed and Seoul dropped away beneath them, Kong realized something fundamental had changed. For 30 years he'd built his life on the principle that attachments were weaknesses, that caring was dangerous, that power came from standing alone and untouchable. He'd been wrong. Real power, the kind that actually mattered, came from having something worth protecting, from choosing to stay when leaving would be easier, from making promises you'd die to keep. The drawing rode in his briefcase all the way to Busan, pressed between contracts and security reports like a reminder that some things were more important than empires. The city never learned the truth. Seoul moved on the way cities do, swallowing stories whole, transforming reality into rumor, turning flesh and blood into legend that grew more distorted with each telling. By the time the whispers reached the right ears, the facts had already been buried under speculation. Some said Chairman Kong had gone soft, that he'd been seen with a woman and child, that his edge had dulled, his reputation crumbling under the weight of domesticity. His rivals watched carefully, testing boundaries they wouldn't have dared approach 6 months earlier. They learned quickly that soft was the wrong word. The territorial dispute in Busan ended in 48 hours instead of 10 days. 3 rival organizations discovered simultaneously that questioning Kang's authority came with consequences that were immediate, absolute, and architecturally creative. He returned to Seoul ahead of schedule with his reputation not diminished but refined, sharper, somehow, like a blade that had found its true purpose. Park understood first. He'd seen the change happen in real time, watched his boss transform from a man who protected assets into someone who protected people. The distinction seemed small but wasn't. Assets could be replaced. People couldn't. "You're different," Park had said carefully on the drive back from Busan. Kong had looked out at the highway lights streaking past. "No. I'm the same. I just finally know what I'm fighting for." The apartment overlooking the Han River became a fixed point in Kang's rotation. Tuesday evenings, Thursday nights, Sunday afternoons. Not because he had to, but because these were the coordinates where his world made sense. Where a 7-year-old girl taught him Korean words she'd learned at school. Where dinner smelled like home instead of power. Where silence was comfortable instead of calculated. Amani grew. Her nightmares stopped. The drawings multiplied. Less rain now, more sunlight. More scenes of ordinary happiness that proved healing was possible even after horror. She learned to laugh without looking over her shoulder. She learned that promises could be kept. Nia rebuilt her life with the same quiet determination that had carried her across an ocean searching for something better. She worked, saved, started taking night classes in business management. The apartment was still Kang's property, the security still his, but she was making plans. Careful, long-term plans that suggested she believed in a future that was stable. "I want to open a restaurant someday," she told Kong one evening while Amani practiced writing at the kitchen table. "Something small. Recipes from home. Maybe in 5 years when I've saved enough." Kong had nodded, already calculating how to make it happen in 3. Not because she'd asked, she hadn't. But because people he protected didn't wait 5 years when 3 would do. The public never knew. The media never reported it. No viral video captured that rainy night when a desperate child ran toward the wrong man at exactly the right moment. Seoul kept its secrets the way it always had, buried under progress, hidden beneath headlines about economic growth and urban development. But in certain circles, whispered in certain rooms, the story evolved into something else. About Chairman Kong, who some said had a family now, who some said had changed, who some said had gone soft. Those who tested that theory stopped talking altogether, because Kong had changed, but not in the way his enemies hoped. He hadn't become weak. He'd become focused. The empire he'd built on fear still stood, but now it had purpose beyond accumulation. Every contract signed, every territory secured, every rival eliminated, all of it served a larger goal now. Protection. Not of assets or interests or abstract concepts of power. Of 2 people in an apartment overlooking the river. Of a girl who drew pictures and called him by a name he was learning to answer to. of a woman who was brave enough to rebuild after the world had tried to destroy her. The city looked at Kong and saw what it had always seen. Power, danger, a man who commanded fear with a glance. They saw the black sedans, the armed guards, the reputation that made even corrupt officials nervous. They didn't see Tuesday dinners. They didn't see homework help or drawings taped to expensive walls. They didn't see the moment when a small hand slipped into his without hesitation, trusting completely. They never understood that the most dangerous thing about Chairman Kong Juntae wasn't his capacity for violence. It was finally having something he refused to lose. In saving them, he did not lose his power. He finally understood it. Thanks so much, my dear friends, for enjoying this beautiful story till this end. If you've not subscribed, kindly subscribe now to be notified when we drop our next story. Also, like the video and comment where you are watching from and what time it's at your end up. Thank you.